Today's the big one. Genesis 6. We're starting to get into Noah and the flood and the ark. So this is probably going to be the big kahuna of videos for a little while. Before we get started, though, I wanted to quickly preface this by saying I've done a little bit more looking into the majestic plural form of Elohim, because there's some very interesting stuff in this passage, and it turns out that it's not as clear-cut as I thought it was before, with Elohim as a definitively plural entity, or collection of entities. And we're going to get into that around about verses 11 through 13, I believe. But the headline here is that there is no majestic we in Hebrew or any other Semitic languages. So there's a majestic plural form for nouns, so Elohim can totally be majestic plural. But there is no majestic plural pronoun. So when Elohim says, let us do X, Y, and Z, that may present a problem. And normally we would say, well, it's just subject-pronoun agreement, right? Just like subject-verb agreement. You wouldn't say they goes to the store. You would say they go to the store, because you want the subject and the verb to agree in the number. If it's they, there's a plural form for go, and that's go instead of goes. And if you were to say the teachers, you would refer to them as they or them. So there's a plural verb mismatch in, Elohim as plural, and then the verb forms are actually singular. So that would indicate that Elohim is in fact singular and is taking the majestic plural. But then there are some pronouns that seem to belie that. Or do they? This is the big question before us, and it took me a long time to study it. Also, really quick, I was going to do just the flood narrative as its own video, all on its own, but turns out the beginning of this passage is a little bit wrong for doing that. And then there's so much material that I have to go over that I'm just going to leave it as is. Now, it's interesting because there seems to be a break a few verses in where a new passage by a new author seems to start. And so I would like to analyze those separately in separate videos, but absolutely no way. This is going to be long enough as is. Let's dive into it, shall we? Verse 1. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply upon the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them. This is a sentence fragment, by the way. I don't know why there's a period in there, in the concordance. We're going to see in a little bit that the concordance actually has some other issues. And I wouldn't necessarily take Strong's to be all that authoritative after all. Logically, there were already daughters, right? I mean, if people were marrying, of course there had to have been daughters of some sort, unless everybody was marrying Eve. So I don't think that's the case. And the previous passage in Genesis 4, I believe, talks about some women that were born. So this just must be just setting a context. Moving on to verse 2, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took for themselves wives of all whomever they chose. Linguistically, the sons of God. Who are the sons of God? Nobody seems to be sure. Sons is Ben, as in, Ben Gurion, just means son of. And it doesn't say Yahweh. It says Elohim again. So, Elohim can mean the gods. It can mean the heavenly host. It can mean human judges. It could mean the name of the singular Hebrew deity, perhaps. We'll explore that later. So it's a little bit ambiguous. What does this mean? Now, if the documentary hypothesis is true, and it does seem to hold water, remember the documentary hypothesis, as discussed before, is the hypothesis that rather than Moses writing the Pentateuch and Joshua finishing it up as claimed, Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are composed of a bunch of different authors, of different groups with different theologies. There's the Yahwists, those that believed in Yahweh. There's the Elohists, those that believed in Elohim, which were different entities. And there's priestly sources and Deuteronomists who entirely wrote the book of Deuteronomy. But according to the documentary hypothesis, there's just mix and match, mashed all together in these books. If that is true, and it does seem to be, then maybe this portion of Genesis 6 is written by a different person, and it still refers to God. But this passage switches back and forth between talking about Yahweh and talking about Elohim. So there has to be a reason for this. It would be exceedingly irresponsible to say that Yahweh and Elohim refer to the same person if it's switching back and forth between the two names throughout. There has to be a reason for it. So the sons of Elohim, who are they? What could they be? Option number one is they are interchangeable, Elohim and Yahweh, or the sons of Elohim are the sons of Yahweh. I don't think that works very well. Another possibility, it's a pretty popular one, is that the sons of Elohim are fallen angels. We see in Job that the sons of Elohim are gathered together, and Satan is one of them. Satan is a fallen angel, right? So perhaps the sons of Elohim are fallen angels having sex with these women and having children. I'm not sure how they would do that. As we understand angels, they are spiritual beings, incorporeal. But of course, this is from a time period where God is walking and blowing into nostrils and so on and so forth. So perhaps the sons of Elohim are similarly physical beings. Could be. Righteous men is another possible thing. The sons of Elohim through the lineage of Seth. These are the righteous men that are having sex with the daughters of men. And you contrast sons of God and daughters of men, and you have, good mating with bad. It's important that whatever's going on here is negative, because we'll see that it pisses Yahweh off. Pisses Elohim off. That's one possibility. Demons having sex with the children of men. Righteous men having sex with wicked women. Another possibility is that the sons of Elohim are the sons of the other deities, and God doesn't want the other deities intermingling with the children of men. And so that pisses him off. Now, this is not the first time we've seen supernatural beings having sex with humans, at least if you're looking at it from a chronological standpoint and you're including the other mythologies that emerged before Judaism. So, the sons of Elohim could be the sons of the other gods. It could be the sons of God, i.e. fallen angels. It could be regular angels, too. Or it could be the sons of the lineage of Seth. It could be all sorts of things. We don't really know. Either way, we got to move on to get more context for this one. On to verse 3. And Yahweh said, now this is Yahweh speaking, not Elohim. Yahweh said, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for indeed he is flesh, and yet shall his days be 120 years. This is where we start to see some problems with the concordance. Really quick first, my spirit. He says, my spirit shall not strive with man forever. What is his spirit? If God is a spirit, then it would be like saying, well, my person isn't going to go to the store today. That wouldn't make any sense. So we saw Ruach Elohim hovering over the face of the water, and we saw God talking and walking and making noise and blowing in nostrils. So is this kind of like saying, you make my heart hurt, or something along those lines? You've moved my soul, perhaps. I think maybe that's a good interpretation. My spirit shall not strive with man forever. Another one is, Ruach means breath, and it could also refer to a voice. So it could mean, I am not going to waste my breath on you. I'm not going to continue to argue with you. Wasting my breath, using my breath. Now, as far as God being spirit, there's an argument about God's Holy Spirit, as in part of the Trinity, being evident in the Old Testament. This is, Messianic Jew / Christian reinterpretation that Jews are very loath to accept. But here's a little bit of it here. Again, Jews don't believe in this concept as a separate being. It's like saying your beautiful face, your Holy Spirit. That's more the interpretation they take, and I think that makes sense. So it shouldn't be treated as a separate entity as the person owning the beautiful face, right? More on that later when we get to Exodus 31 and 35 in like 10 million years. The word strive, it's the word din, and this is the only place in the entire Bible when the word din is used. Nowhere else. Makes it a little bit difficult. Translations: administer, defend, dispute, execute, judgment on, govern, plead, quarrel, strive, vindicate, so on and so forth. Now, since striving is being done with man, ba-adam, it would make sense for this word to mean quarrel, and it's translated as strive. And yet shall be. Here's where there's a problem with the concordance. Number one, it gets worse later. Yet. There's no good reason to include the yet in this, as if it was a disjunction, as in but or however. This is a weird translation. This word, haya, is used all over the place without any disjunction. Will become, was, let there be, and there was. You could just take out the yet and it's fine. So, in other words, my spirit will not argue with man forever, for indeed he is flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. So translation number one, Yahweh said, I'm done wasting my breath arguing with these people. They're just flesh after all, and they're going to be limited to 120 years. Or Yahweh said, and my spirit, whatever that means, will not quarrel with them forever because they're just flesh and they're going to be limited to 120-year lifespans. Again, notice that we're back to Yahweh from Elohim now. There is a break. We are now talking about Yahweh. Why? It's Yahweh saying, my singular spirit will not strive with man forever. Maybe he didn't like the sons of Elohim, which is separate from Yahweh, reproducing with women. Possibility. Now, does this mean that man isn't worth arguing and quarreling with and over because his life is going to be so short? At what point, then, is a lifespan notable enough for an eternal being to bother with? Of course, we see God does continue to quarrel with man and continues to, according to theology today. So maybe what he's saying is, I'm not going to do it forever because they're going to have shortened lifespans. Now, of course, they already had eaten of the tree of knowledge, which means they were doomed to die anyway. So this isn't saying man is going to be mortal. Now, the most popular interpretation of this is that this is where God is shortening people's lifespans. Because we saw in Genesis 5 that people were living 400, 500, 600, 900 years old. 930, I believe, for Methuselah. Just insanely long lifespans. And as we saw, it was probably a numerological age, like the Sumerians were doing. So maybe this passage was written to say, well, God didn't want to keep doing that. Sort of to square it with later folks who weren't doing numerological ages. Or, this is where God changes the lifespans because he doesn't want to deal with the same people over and over and over again forever. I don't want to deal with that guy forever. Obviously, God still strives with man to this day, according to the theology. Moving on to verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. More problems here with the concordance. And we'll get to that in a second. First of all, Nephilim. Boy, did this take some research. And there's all kinds of videos about the Nephilim and the Anunnaki and this and that and ancient alien hypotheses and all sorts of fun, interesting, juicy, ridiculous stuff. Nephilim comes from the root nephil, which means to fall. Maybe. So maybe literally fallen ones. Now, it's often translated as giants, and why is that? There's a lot to go over with the Nephilim. It probably is translated as giants to create harmony with Numbers 13:33, which is the only other place in the Bible the word is used. And Numbers 13:33 says, "And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, which come of the Nephilim, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight." Now, as grasshoppers sort of immediately makes you think as small as grasshoppers, but does it mean size? I don't know. There's the Karate Kid where, little grasshopper. It can be about ability. It can be about prowess. A lack of prowess as compared to the other. If they were as grasshoppers in their own sight, that kind of makes it a little bit strange to think that they were small in their own sight, unless, of course, they were just comparing themselves to the other things. But I think they would view themselves as having less prowess than the other people in their own sight. They realized that they weren't any good, whereas the other people were awesome. So maybe it means they were novices, easy to defeat, Jewish betas to the Nephilim alphas, something like that. Size isn't explicitly mentioned. Now, Nephilim as giants, gigantes in Greek, comes explicitly from when people translate the Septuagint. The Septuagint being, of course, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is what most Jews were using in New Testament times. So, because a lot of these people couldn't actually speak their mother tongue, they were Greek and Roman citizens and stuff. So, the Septuagint is the big one that people translate this stuff from rather than the Hebrew directly, which is a little bit alarming when you think about it. Now, the oldest surviving Hebrew texts are the Masoretic texts, and the Septuagint was supposedly translated from older Hebrew texts that no longer exist. So, the Masoretic texts are seen as inferior to the Septuagint, even though they're in the original Hebrew, because of the date by which things were translated. I don't know by what metric they can tell that the Septuagint, the translation into Greek, is more reliable than the Masoretic texts, which are supposed to just be copies. And we do know that the priests were very, very, very religiously careful about copying explicitly. If they got the teeniest little thing wrong, they had to burn the whole page and start over. So I don't know that the Masoretic text should be taken as less serious than the Septuagint. There's a lot of arguments about that, though, boy. I guess just for now, just know that the Septuagint translates Nephilim as giants, and that's where that comes from. So the sons of God, again, are ambiguous. Now, here's the question. One of the many questions. Who are the mighty men of old, men of renown? The construction of this sentence is bonkers from a linguistics point of view. We don't know the referent for those. So, was it the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men? Is this offspring what the Nephilim is? So we have, in those days, the Nephilim were on the earth. No problem with that, except we don't know what the Nephilim are. And also after that. After what? Well, the word is ken, and it means so, thus, accordingly, so on and so forth, because, inasmuch, things along those lines. Think of it as that which, I think is a good way to translate it into English, as in, I love all that which hath cheese therein, right? In English, we could eliminate that word entirely and say, and after when the sons of God went in unto the daughters of man. There's no way to make this make sense in English unless we translate it that way. As a matter of fact, this is another bad translation. So when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, this phrase there's no problem with, except we don't know who the sons of God are either necessarily. And they bore children unto them. This is the women bearing children unto the sons of Elohim. Those were the mighty men, men of renown. Now, the Nephilim couldn't have already existed before the sons of man went in unto the daughters of man, if they were the offspring. So we can eliminate that. The mighty men, men of renown, cannot refer to the Nephilim, right? That makes sense. It could be the sons of God, who were the mighty men, men of renown, sons of Elohim. Or it could be the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. And that's what most people think. But we don't know for sure because we don't know what those refers to necessarily. So it could have several different interpretations, right? So in those days, the Nephilim, which could be giants or fallen angels, were on the earth, and they were on the earth after the sons of Elohim, which is the heavenly host, or the sons of Yahweh, or the judges, or the righteous men, or the lineage of Seth, or political leaders. So those, the offspring of the sons of Elohim and the daughters of men, or the Nephilim, or the sons of Elohim, were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. We don't know. The most common interpretation is that the giants were on the earth, and they were on the earth after fallen angels had sex and children with the daughters of mankind. And the offspring of that union was these mighty men of renown. The thing is, it's weird to think that this statement here in this verse would introduce us to the Nephilim without explaining anything about who they were and just leave us to guess. It may have just been common knowledge at the time, but why did they bring it up in the first place? You know, if I were to say in those days there were iguanas on the earth, and they were still on the earth after the sons of Elohim went in unto the daughters of men, and these were men of great renown, you'd be left wondering, why the hell did he bring up iguanas? Just to set the context, the time frame here? Could be. But nobody knows who the Nephilim were, so if we don't describe who they were, then how's anybody going to know anything about them? Maybe, again, it was just common knowledge at the time. Okay. The Anunnaki connection. There's another theory about the Nephilim, and that is that they're just analogs of the Sumerian Anunnaki. Don't want to get too into Sumerian stuff, but there's a lot of things that are lent to Hebrew from the Sumerian. So let's look at it and see. And I don't think that this works, actually. Anunnaki comes from a root word which means princely seed or princely blood. Anu, in Sumerian mythology, was the father of the gods and the king of the gods. And so these were the sons of Anu, Anunnaki, sons of the prince. That's what that word means, literally. The idea that the Anunnaki were ancient aliens, big underground cultish sort of an idea that's very common among the hyper woke spiritualists out there. This all comes from one guy who just plain old said it was so, and people have been listening to him ever since. He was around in the 70s. His name's Zechariah Sitchin, and he says the word means those that descended from heaven. It does not. And that's inconvenient because it would be mighty nice as a skeptic to say, oh, you know, they just got the fallen thing from the Sumerian thing that means fallen. Now would just make it an analog and, oh, here's another thing that they're borrowing. However, skeptics don't just want to shut things down. They want to follow the evidence where it leads, even when it's inconvenient. So, unfortunately, no. It would have been nice. Make it very simple, tie a bow on it, call it another borrowed mythology. So this is also contradicted by this guy from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His name is Dr. Michael Heiser. I emailed him and found out he's dead now, so there went any chance of a conversation with him about this. I'm not sure I should trust this guy either. He does seem to have a pro-Bible agenda, and I don't like what he said. I'll explain it. So he's from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he did a lot of work in Hebrew Bible and ancient Semitic languages. Again, his name's Dr. Michael Heiser, and he has a whole website dedicated to disproving Zechariah Sitchin. It's sitchiniswrong.com. So he says, in the form we find it in the Hebrew Bible, if the word Nephilim came from the Hebrew Naphal, it would not be spelled as we find it. The form Nephilim cannot mean fallen ones. The spelling would then be Nephilim. Likewise, Nephilim does not mean those who fall or those who fall away. That would be Nephilim. The only way in Hebrew to get Nephilim from Naphal by the rules of Hebrew morphology would be to presume a noun spelled Naphil and then pluralize it. I say presume since this noun does not exist in biblical Hebrew, unless one counts Genesis 6:4 and Numbers 13:33, the two occurrences of Nephilim, but then that would be assuming what one is trying to prove. However, in Aramaic, the noun Nephilah does exist. It means giant, making it easy to see why the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, translated Nephilim as gigantes, or giant. This seems like a good argument, but how in the world does he know what the vowels are supposed to be and how they're supposed to be spelled? Ancient Hebrew, as you probably know, or you should know, or I'm telling you now, doesn't have vowel markings. Now, it does these days. It has those little diacritic markers underneath the little dots you see underneath some of the words. But that's not how it worked in ancient Hebrew. They didn't have vowels. They didn't have vowel markers. You're supposed to know what goes there. Is he just imagining these vowels in there? I have no idea what he's talking about. Aramaic didn't have diacritic markers until the 7th century AD. Again, I emailed him about this, only to find out he's dead now. So as far as I can tell, this argument doesn't make any sense. I don't think that it works. I would really like to know what he's talking about. Nobody else seems to know what he's talking about. If this guy is an expert in these ancient Semitic languages, though, I guess I would think that he knows something that I don't know. I don't speak these languages. I barely read them a little bit. I'm starting to now that I'm studying it, but not nearly to the level of an expert. And I asked some Hebrew learning folks, and they don't know what he's talking about either. Nobody has any idea what to say about any of this. So if anybody can correct my misunderstanding, please let me know. I want to know what he's talking about, and if it makes any sense whatsoever. On to verse 5. And Yahweh saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was altogether evil all the time. Linguistically, heart means inner man. It's not necessarily indicating that the heart, the physical heart, is the seat of the soul, as the ancient Egyptians believed, although that is likely what the ancient Hebrews thought as well. It just means inner man, but let's just keep track of who's speaking. This is still Yahweh at this point. Elohim doesn't seem to be speaking yet, but Elohim is having grandchildren, assuming that Elohim and Yahweh are different entities, which they almost certainly are. Otherwise, it wouldn't be switching back and forth like this. Verse 6. And Yahweh was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. He was sorry. It means to console oneself, to regret, right? Grieved, to be in pain. We can translate this pretty much exactly as it is. His heart Interesting that it doesn't say ruach, if ruach is spirit and heart and spirit are kind of the same sorts of thing. That's interesting. He's grieved in his heart, your innermost person, which is not the same as your spirit. Huh. Rather, the life seems to be in the ruach, the breath or air, and then the libo, the heart, is maybe emergent of that. Logically, though, here come the skeptics. We have a big problem here. Yahweh was the one that created this mankind, right? Well, maybe, I mean, he had to have been if Yahweh is regretting it, but Genesis 1 says that it was Elohim that did it. Now, if they're separate entities, then Yahweh wouldn't regret making man. So how do we resolve this? It seems like the Yahwists, the folks that believed that God's name was Yahweh, believed that Yahweh and Elohim were one and the same. I would say that has become obvious here. This passage was written by a Yahwist, and Genesis 1 and 2 was written by an Elohist. Now, this is a genuine problem for the reliability and coherence of the scriptures in question. One of the entities, which appears to be singular, is not the same thing as a set of entities which appears to be plural. Now, it may not be the case that one of these entities is plural. As a matter of fact, the case for that shrinks here shortly. But if this isn't proof positive of the documentary hypothesis, and Moses wrote it, then you've got a contradiction. Unless Moses was a Yahwist. In which case, why was he writing about Elohim? This leaves it up in the air. We don't know who created the world. That's a big deal. Was it Yahweh or was it Elohim, or are they the same? We don't know. Now, of course, the big question here, if he was genuinely sorry for having done the thing, that must mean he changed his mind. And you can't change your mind if you know everything. It should be impossible for a being that knows everything to ever change his mind or ever regret anything. Just gotta think about it a little bit, and you realize that it doesn't make sense. If he did it knowing that bad would come of it, then he either has to be okay with bad things happening, which he wasn't because he was sorry, or he did it in spite of the bad things that were going to happen, which means he must be okay with it, but he was sorry. Now, this doesn't contradict any logic up to this point, because there's nothing in the Bible that says yet that God knows everything, and that he never changes, and that he doesn't make mistakes. But it's important. Put a pin in this. Yahweh made a mistake and regretted something that he did. Keep that in mind for later, because that's going to cause major problems and not too terribly long. Verse 7. So Yahweh said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, from man and beast to creeping thing and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. Logically, what did the animals do? I thought God was pissed off at humans. Why is he killing the goats and cows and alligators? What did they have to do with anything? Okay. Moving on. Verse 8. But Noah found grace in the eyes of Yahweh. Linguistically, real quick, grace just means favor, means kind of what you would think it means in English. Eyes, of course, is metaphorical. In my eyes, you are beautiful, blah, 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 so on and so forth. Moving on to verse 9. These are the generations of Noah. Noah, a righteous man, blameless in his generations. With God, Noah walked. Noah walked with God. This appears to be the start of a whole new subject, whole new paragraph, maybe whole new author, whole new passage. The word used for generations here means account, record, birth, genealogical registration, genealogy. It can also mean period, generation, or dwelling. Walked with God. Now, we are back to Elohim again. And we'll see that for the rest of this whole passage, it's all Elohim. Went from Elohim to Yahweh to Elohim to Yahweh, and now we're back on Elohim. Interesting stuff. Now, this is the same word, walking, as is used for rivers, going, walking, rivers, walk. And is the same verb as when God walked, and probably should be taken metaphorically here. Although, who knows, maybe they took walks together. You never know. It does seem to be, again, a new author, because we're back off the Yahweh stuff, back on to Elohim. Verse 10, and Noah begets 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Verse 11, and the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. Linguistically here, corrupt. The earth was corrupt. What does that mean? It means perhaps to go to ruin. It can mean acted corruptly. It can refer to a blemished animal, jeopardized, stifled, ravaged, so on and so forth. Kind of what we think of. Now, before Elohim is interesting. This word before refers to a face or a front. The root word is for face. It can also mean in front of, and that is what we mean by before. Literally means in front of my face, or in front of the face of. What's interesting here is the word before is a preposition, and you've got an object of the preposition, God, Ha Elohim. What we've got here is before, and this is translated as a plural genitive. Genitive makes sense. Genitive is the apostrophe S in English, means possession. So in front of God's face, that's clearly genitive, but why plural? Now, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I asked around and found out that this concordance, as far as I'm able to tell, and as far as this particular forum agrees with me, that this concordance mistranslates it as a plural. It shouldn't be a plural. So I thought I really caught something here because we had a plural pronoun referring to God, and that is, or should be, proof positive that God is a plural form. But the concordance messed it up. So keep that in mind with this Strong's stuff. They don't seem to understand how these things work. And, of course, if I'm wrong about that, and the people I talk to are wrong about that, and the concordance is right, then we've got an issue. You've got a subject-verb disagreement, but a subject-pronoun agreement when there is no such thing as a majestic plural pronoun in Hebrew. Somebody's got something wrong somewhere. The rest of these words mean exactly what we would think that it means. Moving on to verse 12. So Elohim looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt. For all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. When Elohim looked, that verb is singular, and I got to thinking, what other times has Elohim done something, and what are the verbs for that? Went back to Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created. Created refers to a singular, not a plural. It's third person masculine singular for the remainder of Genesis 1. And that would seem to indicate that God, or Elohim, is a singular entity referred to by a plural noun for the royal, the majestic plural. Interestingly, corrupted here is another form of the same root as before, and corrupted is the same. It's another form of the same root. So if you're into this sort of thing, you can sort of see how cases work in ancient Hebrew. Flesh here means anyone, or it means flesh, or it means bodies, or it means mankind, or it means meat. So I think the message is pretty clear. All flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. Seems to me to mean that people were doing things with their bodies that they oughtn't to have done. Like have sex with demons, for instance. Maybe that shouldn't be a thing that you do. Interbreeding is more evidence for the sons of Elohim being non-human. But not fallen angels, if that's what the Nephilim were, because the sons of Elohim and Nephilim are different. Anyway, moving on to verse 13. And Elohim said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Now behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Looking here again at before me, it's very interesting. Noun that is masculine, genitive, plural. Now that means faces, and first-person genitive singular. The first-person genitive singular has come into the mix because the end of all flesh is the subject of that. So before me has two reference here. One is the end of all flesh, and then the other one is before me. You see the end of all flesh marked in the form of this word as first-person genitive singular, and then you see my faces as a masculine plural genitive. Now, there's something wrong here as well. This should not be marked as plural when it comes to my faces. It should be my face before my face. So this threw me for a grave loop because none of it made any sense. I didn't want the solution to be that God is definitely singular in this case, or the pronoun, the possessive pronoun is definitely singular in this case, but that appears to be the case. And once again, Strong's Concordance has shat the bed. So the end of all flesh, that's interesting. It's not the end of humanity, it's the end of all flesh. Why? And he's going to destroy the earth as well, which means the dry land. Remember what the earth means. Remember, this wasn't a planet. There were no planets. This was all the land there was, period. And then everything else was stars and firmament and sky and heavens and seas. Verse 14. Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and outside with pitch. Here comes the ark. Ooh. Ark is the same word actually that's used for Moses when Moses was placed into a basket and sent down the river. Same exact word. It could be from Egyptian T, B, and T, which means chest or coffin. It seems to not be of Hebrew origin, so Egyptian's a pretty good bet because we see here the word for ark, tabat, TBT. Seems like it probably came from Egyptian anyway. We don't know. What is gopher wood? Well, some people think that this word is not original either. It's from an unused root word, which seems to mean to house in. And who houses in woods? Gophers do, especially with cypress trees in that region. So it is probably referring to cypress. Others think it was teak wood, but teak wood isn't native to that region. It's from Southeast Asia, like Indonesia and Malaysia and stuff like that. Rooms means what it means in English, or it could also mean nests. Pitch is from a word meaning to cover, which then became a metaphorical way of talking about bribes or paying somebody's fine. You know, I got you covered, right? But in this case, it's literal bitumen. Bitumen is like tar, kind of, or an asphalt. If you look it up online, there's roads made out of it still, and then there's asphalt roads, which are slightly different. The tarmac is made out of that. It's either occurring naturally, but most often it is found as a byproduct of burning coal or wood. It's good for waterproofing. It's black, it's sticky, it's tar-like. So however they were making pitch back in the day, he told Moses to make a whole ton of it, a whole lot of it. All right, verse 15. And this is how you shall make it. 300 cubits shall be the length of the ark, 50 cubits the width, and 30 cubits the height. What's a cubit? Well, a cubit, traditionally speaking, is the length from the tip of your elbow to the tip of your middle finger. That's different for everybody, so it's not a very reliable method of measurement. Actually, foot comes from the same thing. Somebody measured the foot of some really large fellow, and it was 12 inches long, and that is what they decided a foot was. Nobody else has a 12-inch foot, I don't think. I know I sure don't. So on average, it's somewhere between 42 and 48 centimeters, which is 17 to 19 inches. So how long is 300 cubits? Well, that is approximately 450 feet or 137.16 meters. A football field, just for reference, is 120 yards or 360 feet. So this thing's going to be 45 feet tall by 75 feet wide by 450 feet long. Or, in other words, 13.7 meters tall by 36 meters wide by 137.16 meters long, or thereabouts. Verse 16, you shall make a window for the ark, and to a cubit shall you finish it from above, and set a door in the side of the ark. With lower, second, and third decks shall you make it. Okay, so 3 stories. That adds up, right? Most 3-story buildings are 33 to 40 feet. I looked that up. This is slightly taller than that, of course, but of course this is for animals, and some of the animals are taller than people. So that makes sense. The door on its side worries me a little bit, just logistically and leak-wise, but that's okay. I did the math. Boy, do I hate math, but I did it anyway. Look at how giving I am. It's 2,531,250 square feet of interior space, which is 71,677 square meters. Obviously, though, there's walls and roofs and ceilings and support beams too, but that's still rather a lot of space. Of course, that's total space. That's total square footage, not just the surface area, which is where you're going to want to keep the animals. Animals aren't going to be on the top deck because it's raining fiercely and they're going to topple overboard and stuff. So that means you got 2 stories worth of approximately 18 feet high. These are 2 levels of animals then that are both around 18 by 70 by 440-ish. Subtracting a little bit for the walls and so on and so forth. And that gives us a total of 92,400 square feet of surface area. Verse 17, and behold, I am bringing a flood of waters on the earth to destroy all flesh in which is the breath of life from under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. Still wondering why the animals, but okay. Linguistically, bringing is to come in, to come, to go in, to come and bring. Probably best to think of this as coming with, which is basically bringing. I'm bringing a flood. I'm coming around and I'm bringing a flood with me. Ruach, again, is back. This is the breath of life as in animals. When God breathed into man the breath of life, which is supposed to be spirit, this is the same word. Animals have it too. So I don't understand why it's said that man has something that animals don't, according to the creation story. They seem to have the same thing. Adam got it through the nostrils. The other animals didn't. Maybe it was the nostrils that made all the difference. I don't know. On the earth, Ba'aretz. Again, still not a planet here. This refers to the ground on planet Earth, which is the only ground there is in the universe, with stars in the atmosphere and gates in the sky keeping out the water on the other side. Remember Genesis 1:7, God made the firmament and he divided the waters that were under the firmament and the waters that were above the firmament. From under heaven, heaven is the sky. So, couple questions, logically speaking. Number 1, do aquatic creatures have the breath of life as well? I think that's a fair question. Why, if he's wiping out all the land animals, is he not wiping out all the sea animals? Do they not have the breath of life too? He said he was going to wipe out everything that had the breath of life. Well, he said that he was going to do that on the earth. Maybe he doesn't care about under the water. Again, why is he wiping out the animals? And, why is he going through all this trouble? He can snap his fingers and get it done. If he wants everybody dead but Noah, just why all the stuff going on here? Of course, there were popular stories at the time from Samaria about the Great Flood and Gilgamesh and all of these lovely stories that were probably running around in Canaan at the time, and this is probably just an adaptation of that story. Of course, we can't look at it that way if we're just reading what the Bible says. But the parallels are certainly very interesting. Verse 18. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark, you and your sons and your wife, and the wives of your sons with you. Linguistically, cum is stand, arise, confirm, strengthen, build. I think confirm or establish as written works pretty well. Covenant works pretty well as well. Treaty, covenant, allyship, allied, so on and so forth. He's making a promise to Moses, or he's cutting a deal with Moses. Not 100% sure which, but he just says what he's going to do. So here's the deal, in other words. Verse 19. And of every living thing, of all flesh, 2 of every kind shall you bring into the ark, to keep them alive with you. Male and female they shall be. 2 of every living thing you shall bring onto the ark. Bring means what it means in English. He's supposed to gather them. When I was a kid, I played this one video game. I wasn't allowed to play most video games, but there was one set of video games where you play as Noah and you go gather all the animals. I imagine that it would be something like that. Imagine corralling giraffes and tigers. How do you do such a thing? I don't know. Well, so all is clear here except for the word kind. Of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every kind shall you bring. The word kind isn't actually in there. And I got real excited when I first saw that, hey, you know what? The word kind isn't even in there. So all that Answers in Genesis stuff about kinds, it's not even in the Bible. Well, it is a couple verses later. I got a little ahead of myself. But that's not in there. It's 2 of every. It's kind of implied. You shall bring into the ark to keep them alive. Moving on to verse 20. Of the birds after their kind, and of animals after their kind, of every creeping thing of the earth after its kind, 2 of every kind will come to you to be kept alive. Now, kinds. Here we go. Answers in Genesis back again. Answers in Genesis is always talking about kinds, and that's probably because if by this God meant species, well, everybody knows, and Answers in Genesis affirms that there would not have been enough room whatsoever on the ark for 2 minimum of every species on the earth. That's pretty insane, actually. Not even close to enough room. Also, remember that in Job, there's behemoths and dragons and all these gigantic animals as well. So, yeah, definitely not. Now, I'm not going to bother getting into taxonomy and why, as a biological term, kinds doesn't work at all. It's completely an incoherent thing, especially when you get into what constitutes a human versus an ape, the human kind versus the ape kind. Things get really, 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 really squishy. And it gets to the point of just minute little differences here, and then in other species where it's more convenient, they're much larger gaps. Forrest, Valkai, Gutsick, Gibbon, Aaron Ra, these folks have some very, very, very good resources on that. And I will get you some videos here in the description. But kind is an awful term if you're trying to classify things, and it's weirdly malleable and changes depending on its context. So I don't want to reinvent the wheel that they've already invented. So if you want to see why kind doesn't make any sense taxonomically or scientifically, go see them. So here's what Answers in Genesis has to say. The first thing that needs to be addressed is, what is a kind? Often people are confused into thinking that a species is a kind, but this isn't necessarily so. A species is a man-made term. They're all man-made terms, by the way, used in the modern classification system. And frankly, the word species is difficult to define. That's true, whether one is a creationist or not. There is more on this word and its definition in relationship to kinds later in this chapter. The Bible uses the term kind. The Bible's first use of this word, Hebrew is min, is found in Genesis 1 when God creates plants and animals according to their kinds. It is used again in Genesis 6 when God instructs Noah to take 2 of every land-dwelling, air-breathing animal onto the ark, and also in God's command for the animals to reproduce after the flood. A plain reading of this text infers that plants and animals were created to reproduce within the boundaries of their kind. Evidence to support this concept is clearly seen, or rather not seen, in our world today. as there are no reports of dats, dog plus cat, or hows, horse plus cow. So a good rule of thumb is that if two things can breed together, then they are of the same created kind. Well, that's what a species is. Mostly. It is a bit more complicated than this, but for the time being, this is a quick measure of a kind. Answers in Genesis. The National Center for Education describes it this way. A kind, or baramin in creationist jargon, is the unit of life originally made by God. Within each kind is an enormous potential for variation, resulting, during the past 6,000 years or so, in a large number of similar animals that scientists classify into species. Meyer contends that he created into the reproductive apparatus of genes and chromosomes the possibility of endless hereditary combinations, producing the possibility of endless variety within each kind. By juggling the number of kinds, LaHaye and Morris reduced the total population aboard the Ark to 50,000 or so. Whitcomb and Morris reduce it to 35,000, while Dr. Arthur Jones squeezes it down to a bare-bones total of 1,544. So, the idea is kind of like the idea they had for why incest was okay. Original humans had within their gametes all of the potential for life. It wasn't something that developed down the line as we observe it happening now. It was these huge coiled up potential things in there. It doesn't work that way. At least it doesn't now. And they're just proposing that's how it used to work. I'm reminded of the Dark Side of the Moon prism. It's one thing in and all these possible things out. As each successive generation was expressing new phenotypes and kind of, drilling down, specifying into black people over here and Asian people over here and white people over there. So the equine kind became zebras and horses and donkeys and other now extinct one, which is important. Now extinct ones. That's important because creationists say that most, if not all, fossils came from the flood. So if we have fossils of these now extinct equine kinds and other kinds, this is a problem for them. If they came from after the flood and all the fossils are from before the flood, that blows that theory up. And we do have such fossils. Also, we have to assume that animals weren't evolving before then, if that's the case, because all the original kinds degenerated such that their offspring would never again reach the hereditary variability of the parent, in Dennis Wagner's words. I mean, okay, let's say they took two of the lion kind, right? And no other member of that family. This means lions evolved into house cats after the flood by the time Egypt was around, because Egypt had house cats by, at latest, the 2nd millennium BCE. That's weird. The flood was supposed to have taken place between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, if you go by the Bible's literal timeline. So if that's how fast that creationists' version of adaptation within kinds works, we would have seen successful evolution of lions into cheetahs and jaguars and tigers and leopards and cougars and snow leopards and house cats over the course of 2,000 years. That's awfully fast for evolution to work. Or adaptation, or microevolution, as the creationists prefer to call it. So, that alone is a new species every 285 years. And the problem is we knew that Sumerians knew about leopards and panthers and lions, and they way predated any of that stuff. So, another issue is Noah definitely would have thought of a lion and a panther as different kinds, right? Wouldn't you? I know I would. They don't look all that similar. But these are members of the same genus. Different kinds within the same genus. And Answers in Genesis is talking about zooming out further than genus, almost to the family level here. So, wow. We're talking about, then, if it comes to these cats, just as a for instance, a Felidae ancestor. The precursor of lions and panthers and leopards, maybe like a saber-toothed tiger or something. At a time after Sumerians already knew about lions and panthers. So this ancestor then spawned the Panthera ancestor and the baby cat ancestor and the caracal ancestor, the ocelot ancestor, the lynx ancestor, the puma ancestor, the leopard cat ancestor, and the domestic cat ancestor. And then all of those ancestors branched out into lions and leopards and jaguars and tigers and snow leopards and clouded leopards and Bornean clouded leopards and Asian golden cats and Bornean baby cats and marbled cats and ocelots and lynxes and pumas and cheetahs and jaguars and Asian leopard cats and fishing cats and wild cats and sand cats and black-footed cats and jungle cats and domestic cats, all within 2,000 years. There are 37 species of cats, with domestic cats having separated from wild cats most recently. So that's a new species every 54 years. If we're being the most generous we can be. Now, great cats live on average around 13 years. So if we're going to stay generous, this means every fourth generation is producing a type of offspring so different that they can no longer interbreed with the family that they came from. Now, what would that do for evolution? We would have discovered evolution a lot quicker if that was the case, and there would be a lot more evidence for it, if that's how fast things moved, and they don't anymore. So what was going on then, folks? I don't even want to think about how many beneficial mutations it would take that quickly. Just tons of them. Different jaws and different colors and different claws and different digestive tracts. All beneficial that quickly. Absolutely absurd notion that could possibly work. And Sumerians were, anyway, already talking about these things long before the Bible says that the flood would have happened, if you're taking it literally. So the science of this, again, it's too time consuming to do here in this kind of video. There's so many problems with this, and there are so many videos already in papers and books and large portions of people's careers devoted to science that debunks the possibility of this being true. I'm just here to tell you what it says, guys, even if what it says doesn't work. And in this case, I don't want to go into great detail about why it doesn't make any sense, but okay. I hate math, but I did some math, so let's look at it, just for one argument against it. All right. So we've got 92,400 square feet of surface area, right? It's a little under a quarter of a stadium's worth of space, especially given the space taken up by the walls and the beams and stuff. We also haven't even thought about the space and the weight taken up by the food yet. The weight doesn't appear to be an issue here. Even if it is chock full, this boat is massive and it wouldn't sink just from the weight. It could hold up to 119,424,000 pounds. So let's not worry about the weight. But the space is another story. If they were all packed in tight and not moving at all, we'd be looking at 22.73 miles, or 120,000 feet of necessary surface area for just the animals. That's assuming 10,000 pairs of animals not moving and a total average area of space of 6 feet per animal. And you know what? Let's cut it in half. That's 60,000 square feet, just to be extra generous. Now, let's add just elephant food. Elephants eat on average 4 to 5 bales of hay in captivity per day. And these bales of hay that they eat are approximately 4 by 5 in length and width in feet. Assuming 3 bales of hay can be stacked, that's 60 square feet in a stack, or 20 square feet per bale. 2 of them would require, on the low end, 160 square feet of food space in a day. Multiply 160 square feet by 365 days, you get 58,400 square feet of just elephant food. 1/3 of that is surface, assuming they're all stacked neatly. So that's 19,466 square feet of the available total, 92,400 square feet of surface space, taken up just by elephant food. So, since we're being generous, we're subtracting only 60,000 square feet of surface area from the available 92,400, which leaves us with 12,634. You're down to 13% surface area, and all we've gotten on the ark is extremely crammed in animals, ridiculously crammed in, and that's only accounting for 2 pairs. We're not even talking about the clean animals, 7 pairs. And elephant food. 13% of the ark is left for the rest of the food. Now, how much space do you think you'll have left once you factor in the food for the rest of the animals, right? And remember, Answers in Genesis says there were brontosauruses on the ark as well, and hippopotamuses, and yeah. So, absolutely no way that this would work whatsoever. I hate math. Let's be done with the math now. Thank you. So, they seem to be turning a vernacular kind into a phylogenetic classification that is squishy and moves all around, and that's not scientific. You don't do science with that. So, sure, they can posit that it was kinds that were being taken into the ark rather than species, but they're inventing this from thin air with no taxonomic coherence. In other words, this is 100% made up out of thin air. Sorry. Think of it this way. If I told you to grab one of every kind of vegetable in the store, would you know what I meant? What if you grabbed a yellow onion and a sweet onion and a red onion and shallots, but I just wanted you to grab an onion? Now, do we have a coherent taxonomic term when I say kind, or do I need to specify what I mean by it? No, we don't have a definition for it. It's vernacular. It's not taxonomic. Verse 21, and you shall take for yourself of all food that is eaten, and you shall gather it to yourself, and it shall be for you, for them, food. I don't want to get into the for you, for them. You'll all be able to eat with this food. And logically, again, just absolutely not. Now, it's probable that they didn't think there were that many kinds of creatures out there. For instance, penguins and polar bears. They're not going to know about that. I don't think they went out and captured any kangaroos, for instance. They probably thought this was a lot more feasible at the time that they wrote it because they didn't have a knowledge of how many animals there were all across the world. Again, leading credence to the idea that this is a local thing. Otherwise, just absolutely not. There's no way. So, thus did Noah, according to all that God had commanded him. So he did. Some more logic. Number 1, how does plant life survive a flood for an entire year? Most plant life is going to die. Plants require air and sunlight and nutrients from the soil. Seaweed and algae could do pretty well. There's some species that can go dormant, like certain lotus flowers can go dormant. And there are some plants that might be able to survive, but all the trees are going to die. Okay? If God is protecting the plant life and making them immune to the effects of flooding, such that there's going to be functioning olive tree at the end of this story, and grass for the livestock when they disembark, well, why not just make the rest of the life you want to spare also immune from the water? I mean, you're doing miracles for the plant life, but you can't do it for the animal life? What's up? Now, from a moral standpoint, of course, far be it from me, of course, but if I were to kill millions and millions of animals and millions of humans, you would think that I was a bad person. And I would probably be a pretty bad person. I'd agree with you there. If anyone else did that, we'd call them bad. I cannot extract any moral virtue from this story. Can you? So if it's a parable or fable or whatever, I can't see what its point is, except to scare you, except to get you absolutely terrified of this absolute genocidal maniac who doesn't make any sense. So, if we've got a differentiated Yahweh and Elohim, Elohim having sons that have sex with human women and, or, demons and or giants, you got a genocide of the entire world, insanely rapid evolution afterwards, and plant life surviving a year-long flood. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself there, but we all kind of know the story, I'm assuming. We have to take a pause and wonder for a moment if this is good enough for us. It's not quite good enough for me from a moral standpoint, from a logic standpoint, from a math standpoint, and I don't think that it's good enough for you either.